Okay, morning folks. So we're going to start the Chapter 13 lecture, and Chapter 13 is working with forms. You could also call them web forms. These are things that you are familiar with if you've used any part of the World Wide Web. Particularly if you've searched for something on Google, if you've made an account anywhere on the internet. You put in, what is your name? What is your password? Where do you live? What is your credit card? If you've searched on Google, if you've made an account on any website, if you have purchased anything, you've used a web form. If you filled out a survey, on a product, you've used a web form. And so web forms are commonly found everywhere on the internet, on the World Wide Web, and so they are important for that reason. They're just very common. When it comes to Chapter 13, what we're going to learn to do is how to code the front end of web forms, how to work with front end web forms. And I need to break down this front end language. If I haven't done that for you guys before, I need to kind of describe what does that mean. But basically, we're going to learn the HTML and CSS. And so you could really think of front end as HTML and CSS. All the different HTML controls, all the CSS to change how it looks, all of the attributes and selectors. And then there is a little bit of search functionality that we can get out of this. But it's very basic. I would even go as far to say is it's not even useful. And so, again, more attributes. An interesting term here called regular expressions, which I'm sure our third semester students are familiar with. Describe the use of a data list, and again, they kind of go into search functions. So let's break this down a little bit before I go too deep into this. I'm just going to type some notes here. When it comes to web forms, there's two parts that are important. The first part is the front end. The front end is the text box, it's the check box, submit button, it's the style of all of these things. In other words, how do they look on the page? Style on the page itself. Okay, and so when you boil that down into, well, what languages do you write? Is you write HTML and CSS. And so this is what we're learning in this chapter. We are learning the front end of a web form with HTML and CSS. What we're not learning is the back end code. Oh, by the way, the other language that's typically put in front end is JavaScript. Even though JavaScript can be back end as well, we're going to learn these three languages this semester: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Backend code makes the front end useful. In other words, it's just a pretty picture. It's just a form. This form doesn't really do anything. It doesn't search. It doesn't create an account. It doesn't filter your favorite songs when you search by your artist. Okay, the back-end code is what makes the front end actually work. I could say useful, makes the front end work. And so what we're kind of doing in this chapter is learning the fundamentals of web forms that once you learn a back-end language, that then it becomes all useful. Like it's kind of a fake out, this chapter. This chapter is kind of a fake out in the sense of like, we're going to learn web forms kind of because they're not really that useful yet. It's not useful until you learn the back-end code. And what are the languages for the back-end code? Well, there's a bunch of them. There's a bunch of different languages. One is that we used to teach here at the college was called C#. Actually, you'll learn C# next semester, but so that's still taught. My mistake. We also at the college, you will learn JavaScript on the back end. PHP is a back end language. Java, which is different than JavaScript, right? Java is a back end language. Boy, there's tens of hundreds of these. Ruby, and we will get into more. Okay, good. One that was also suggested is SQL. Okay, that's also considered back-end code, structured query language, which is really when you're working with databases. And so there's some front-end languages that we're learning in this chapter. This is a foundation for what you will continue learning in second and third semester. In your third semester, you tie in everything all together. You tie in the bootstrap that we've been learning. You tie in all the HTML and all the forms and all the tables and the flexbox and the grid view and, the CSS. You tie that in with a back-end language and you make a fully functional when you have both the first part plus the second part, they call that full stack development. Okay, so right now we're doing front end development, and there are front end developers as their full-time job to do HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and to work on websites, front ends of the websites. There are full developers that only work on the back end, that only work with SQL, or they only work with PHP, or they only work with C#. Okay, so there are front end jobs, front end developers. There are back end developers, and then there's full stack development. Now this is just really rough numbers here, but in St. Louis, an experienced front end developer might earn something like that. An experienced back-end developer can easily break 6 figures. And an experienced full-stack developer, well, I don't know what the ceiling might be, but safe to say I'm just going to guess an average. This is rough, okay? This is really rough, but just to give you an idea that front end typically doesn't get paid as well as back end, and then full stack can pay a lot more. I know personally full stack developers that are graduates of Rankin that make 150 plus, and I know several of them. It's not that uncommon if you're good at what you do in St. Louis that you can earn these kinds of salaries. And you don't have to have a bachelor's degree. You don't have to have a master's degree. You just have to be really good at full stack. And what you're learning at Rankin throughout the semesters is full stack development. All that just to say is we're just learning a piece of that today. We're not learning the whole thing. Now, what I wanted to do was, because we have a third semester student hanging out with us this morning, Troy, Troy's in his third semester. Troy's learning full stack development. And so I wanted to kind of shut up and get out of the way and let Troy show what he's learned in third semester a little bit, that kind of shows off this back-end code before we dive a little bit deeper in the front-end code. Troy, you still with me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to stop my stream on Discord. I'm still recording. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop up Discord here. And can you start a screen share?
Yeah.
There you are. So I'm going to watch. If you guys all want to hop in Troy's stream. Okay, Troy, so you want to show us, how about you start with the front end? Let's start with the HTML. It looks like you're on it.
Yeah, okay, so this is the lab that I'm doing for class right now. And if we click here, it'll take us to the login page, and that's made with this section over here.
Okay, so obviously you've got some HTML there. You got a main, a div, an H1. You see? Can you show off the form tag?
Yes, let me separate here.
Okay, so let's look at the form tag. You want to explain what's going on there?
All right, so to start off with, method and action, you guys won't use these much right now, but they're very important when you actually get forms to work. Method is essentially the way the kind of information it sends to the server. And so usually when you're giving it information, you use post. There's two other ones that you can use for sending information, but post is going to be the main one to use. And then action in this case is essentially the route that you want the form to send to when it posts this information. And so in here you can see I have an input for the username.
So is that essentially the action is essentially saying go to the login page?
Kind of, but not exactly. It's
right.
Kind of saying go to the place where you handle the login.
That's right. Where you've essentially where the backend code exists to handle the login.
Yes.
So so essentially what we're saying is that there's a login script, you could call it, a login script, that when the user does put in their username and password and they click login, you're going to send that information to this script to determine if it's a valid username and password.
Yes.
There you go.
If you see this account part right here, it actually coincides with this because that's actually where it's going. It's going into this JavaScript file. And then inside of that JavaScript file is another specification for it detects, and there's a /login as well as a /account. These parts right here is essentially how the server sends information back to this form. So you guys won't be doing any of this, but
yeah, staying focused on the HTML, you see what do you got there?
So the button is actually very important for a form. I'm actually not using this right, but your button should always have a type of submit to actually submit the form. In this case, it kind of worked without it, but in terms of like, what's the word I'm looking for?
Semantic.
Like standards, yeah, semantics and standards. You always want to include this part into your form. So all of your forms are going to have a type of submit because they're supposed to submit to the form.
And so we definitely have some bootstrap classes there, like div class of form group. For the username and password, can you kind of highlight the line that makes the username text box?
So this one right here.
Yep. So you guys can see, and this is kind of foreshadowing the lecture a little bit, you've got an input type of text. So an input tag with a type attribute of text. You've got a class of form control. That's a bootstrap class that makes that text box responsive. You got an ID that you can style it with CSS. You got a name, which you could target the name in the JavaScript. And then you got a value of, is just an empty string there?
It's a server.
Okay, and that's something that we'll cover more in that third semester. So Troy, can you demonstrate this working?
Yes. I actually don't know if I have an account logged in here, so I'll have to steal one. So this is the database that essentially runs this entire thing.
Now, because this lecture is going, on YouTube, it's going to be public on the internet, it's probably safe to say that this is all dummy data.
Yeah, this is all fake. So if I copy this and I hit login, it should hopefully work.
So we're logging in as Constance. I can't read the name, but
me neither. It's just a random assortment of letters that is turned into a username, and you can see all their fake information is filled in here. But if we go back, if I just hit login, it throws errors. So this is something that's validated on the server side. If I just put in, I don't think I have that one. So if I just put in one, it still needs the second.
Yeah, it's awesome. That's exactly what I was looking for. Thank you for kind of showing that. So what it takes to get from where we are to where Troy is, obviously, you have to understand the front end, but then you're going to learn in your next semester, in your second semester, you're going to learn a back-end language. You're going to learn C#. And then in your third semester, you're going to learn JavaScript on the back end. So this semester, we're learning HTML, CSS, and front-end JavaScript. Second semester, you're learning your first back-end language. And then third semester, you're learning your second and really third back-end languages because you cover JavaScript on the back end and you cover SQL. And actually, we start covering SQL next semester as well. So there's obviously a long path, from where we're at to where you're going. But this is it. This is full stack web development that Troy's showing off. Obviously, it's front end HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and the back end is the database and more JavaScript. Just Troy, can you show the account.js?
So it's actually pretty large, but this is the one. So from here all the way down to here is just what handles the login. The registers are rather large.
Yeah.
So you can see it goes from 60 to 153. It's collapsed right now. If I open it, it goes down quite a bit.
Yeah, and so not showing this to intimidate because we've got a long time between where you are and where you're going. But hopefully you kind of say, oh man, this is awesome. This is exactly what I want to learn. That's the goal here. So anything else worth showing, Troy?
No, I think that's it, and without complicating things too far.
Cool. Thank you. All right. Let me get back to my screen share. Whoops. Open up Visual Studio real quick, or as quick as it will let me. The first tag is the form tag, the form element, and as Troy demonstrated, the name, the action, the method, the target, these are all attributes. And so let's go through these. Let's go through these as part of the form tag. So anytime you have a control, any form control must be nested inside of a form tag. Okay, so here's a form tag, and then you notice if I quick use Emmet to kind of fill it in, the first thing is it gives us as an action. And the action attribute directs the form to the server side code to handle the data. And so if you're logging in, you got a username and password, you're going to send the action, maybe as Troy did, to account/login. And, you know, again, so the account was a file. You know, he had something on his computer called account.js. So that was a JavaScript file. And then the login would be the part of the file inside of that long file. There was a certain part of it called login, or whatever it may be. So again, the action attribute says, hey, take this information and send it here. Okay, so without this action attribute, this form tag's kind of useless. Like, you're just gonna have a form, the user can fill out information, but the information is not going to go anywhere. And so it's a really important piece when you're doing this for real. Right now, we're not doing it for real; we're doing it for fake. Let me get Discord over here. Okay, so that's the action attribute. What else did we have? The method. Okay, there's a method attribute. And you can see here there's a couple common ones, get and post. As Troy demonstrated, post is more secure. I even say the most secure option. And so if you're using something that needs to be secured, for example, a password, you don't want someone intercepting the password, so you want to use a method of post. Credit card information, personal information, passwords, you want to use a method of post. The other option is get. As far as the method of post is most secure.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Your video box is slightly skewed.
Yeah. There we go. Thanks. No, don't be sorry to interrupt. Feel free to chime in anytime. Get is less secure. But when you don't have to secure the data, in other words, you don't have to encrypt it, you get a speed, but increased performance. Okay? And so if you're dealing with non-sensitive information, you could use the method of get. And what you find out that while post would encrypt information, a get uses get uses what's called a query string to send the information back from the client to the server. And in the query string, that's just part of the URL. Okay, so that's the difference between a method of post and the method of get. Post is more secure, but it's a little bit, there's a speed, and it's negligible, right? It's not like a big deal. So most of the time you just do method of post. Method of get uses the query string. It's a little bit faster. Then there's a name attribute, and you could just call this my first form. And the name attribute is used oftentimes in the JavaScript. If you wanted to work with this form in the JavaScript, you could reference it by its name. Okay, and then let's see what the other attribute they have on here is target. And don't really use target all that often. Troy, do you use target in third semester?
No.
Yeah, let's. On the form, I'm drawing a blank, to be honest. I think what it does is when you click, well, just like in the anchor tag, if you put a target of blank on the anchor tag, it opens it up in a new tab. So I suppose what it would do was your response page that comes back from the server would open up in a new tab if you set it to a target of blank. Again, but that's most of the time you just want it in the same tab, so that's why we don't really use target. But that's how you could use the target attribute, although I don't find that very useful most of the time. Okay, now so that's the form tag, and again, the form control is kind of like the parent of everything else. All controls go inside the form tag. Most pages only have one form. Okay, so you don't need to have like 10 different forms. You are allowed to have multiple forms on a page, but most of the time you're just going to have one. And so all of your controls, all your buttons, all your text boxes, everything's going to go most of the time inside of this form tag. If you put like a text box here, no, that's outside the form tag. That's not where it belongs. Yeah. So if you were to put the text box outside of the form tag, okay. So don't put any controls outside of the form tag. That's just a common mistake. I also see people making like 10 form tags for each control. They have its own form tag. That's not necessary. You can put multiple. So inside of the form tag, you've got the input. The input tag is a tag that closes itself. In other words, there is no closing input tag. Okay, so you don't need, in old versions of HTML, you'd actually put the / right like that, but in HTML5, that's not a requirement. And so the input tag itself is used in this chapter just probably 15 times. You're going to see many, many controls that are all coded with the single tag input. Okay, and the way that it renders a different control is with this type attribute. The type attribute says, okay, this control is a text box. And so that's how we get a simple text box here. Okay. Typically what you do is you put a label, and there's a couple ways of doing a label. This is the way that I prefer. You open a label tag, got a bad habit of not showing the code. I'm looking at this screen. Anyways, multiple screens. It can be confusing. Sorry about that. So here we have a label, and now we have this label associated. And what's nice about this is that if you click on the label, if you click on first name, you'll notice it focuses the control. And so let me close this. There we go. So if I say label, and I'll show you another way of coding this label. Okay, and so again, what we have here is if you click on the label, it focuses the control that it's associated with. You can see that all of these are inline elements, so none of these are causing line breaks. And go back to the code here. If you want a line break, of course, you could use CSS, or you could just use a little BR tag. And that would work as well. Let me show you this other technique for using a label. Label for city. And then what we'll do is we'll do an input control. This one doesn't have to be nested. Input, type of text, ID of city. And this label will say CITY. Okay, and so this is just like the parent is the label, the child is the text box as well as the text. This one, these are two sibling tags. Label for city, which matches up with the ID of city. So the for attribute ties it into the ID of the control, and then you just wrap it like that. That should work just the same. We click first name, focuses that all the way down to city. So two different ways of working with labels for these controls. Again, I think the easier one to remember is this first way. So when it comes to the most common control tag is the input tag. Again, I'm just making this up, but there's probably 15 or more controls that are all coded with the input tag. It's all done with this type attribute. By changing the type attribute, you change the control. Again, the name is used for JavaScript, and so when we get into JavaScript, we'll be referencing controls by their name. Disabled would make it gray. This is a read-only attribute. You just say disabled, and of course you get this annoying gray box that you can't click in. You can toggle that on and on with JavaScript, so it could be disabled by default, and then if you do something, you click a certain checkbox, you would set disabled equal to false, which would turn it from a gray box into a usable box. Okay. So that's disabled. And then read-only makes it so that they can type in it, but they can't. Read-only is also a Boolean attribute where they can't. I'm typing, it's typing, it doesn't matter. This is typing, I go to city, I can't type. So if I were to go value is St. Louis and mark it as read-only, you can see the city is St. Louis by default, but you can't change it. So read-only and read-only versus disabled are a couple of different attributes that change those controls. And these are the common attributes regardless of the control. And so you can kind of see here some form controls that have a name for the JavaScript. And action is important to remember. The action goes to the server-side script to handle the data. The method deals with how the information is sent from the client to the server. Is it post or is it get? Then we have a text box here, and here's another type of control, input type of submit, and this is something that Troy showed. Let's do an input tag, type of submit, and let's just look at a submit button. What the submit button does is it actually submits the data to the server. In this case, there is no account login, so its page isn't working since that's just made up. But that's the importance of a submit button. The submit button is really important because that's how you send the information from the client to the server. And so submit's an important button. Back in the day, it used to not just say submit, it used to say submit query, which was confuse people. So you would change the value of this input to be I don't know, maybe this would be like a register button. And so the button says register instead of submit. So that's your submit button. And there's input type of submit, there's input type of reset, which would reset your form to the default values. And then there's input type of button, which the input type of button doesn't have any default behavior. A submit button has a default behavior, whereas an input type of button does not. Okay, so there's your simple web form. Here, if you use a method of get, okay, remember I said that get uses a query string, and this is what that looks like. If you've ever searched on Google and get the results page and it looks something like this, everything that comes after this question mark is your data. And so that's not very secure. Therefore, you really don't want to put credit card numbers up there. You don't want to put passwords up there. If you use get as the method, again, it's a little bit faster, but it's just simply not secure. So most of the time you use post. Okay, so when we're looking at this, there's two types of, and this is where it gets a little confusing. You have an input type of button. Let's do that. Input type of button. And now that I've changed that input type of submit to button, it doesn't have a default behavior. Input type of button, you need to use JavaScript to tell it what to do. Okay, and when we get into writing JavaScript, we'll learn how to wire that up to some JavaScript to like give this some functionality. Maybe you calculate shipping and handling or something like that. But this input type of button has no default behavior. There's also a button tag, which has some different attributes. Let's just say button. Close the button. Take the value off. And this button works kind of the same way. So it's just a different way to code the button. In fact, I don't think you need the type of button. So I prefer the input type of button for this. So I'll just undo to what I had. There we go. Input type of button. Let's see. The one benefit of using the button element is if you had an image and you wanted that image to be your button, you could use a source attribute. So you'd use a button source, and then if you had literally an image of a button, I would do whatever. If you had an image of a button and you wanted this button to look like this on your web page, you could save this image and then use I'm not going to spend the time to do it. You could use the source attribute of the button element to make it what it looks like, to make your button look like that image, I should say. Okay, so again, just a review: input type of button, input type of submit, submits the form, input type of reset, does exactly what it says. It resets the form to its default value, so if a user were to fill it all out and they click the reset, it would just go away. You could also do an input type of image, and this is kind of what I was describing with the button tag, but this is done with the input tag, where you're using that image as what it looks like on your page instead of a generic looking control there. Here's an example of using that button type of submit with an image tag nested within it. So again, same functionality, basically, just coded differently. They make these things multiple ways of coding them. So all these different kinds of buttons. This one here, this fourth one, obviously being the image that they're using. Okay, back to a couple of attributes for the input element. We've got value, which I've shown. So, for example, if I put my last name in here, it's going to be the default value that's in the text box. Like here, I have the value of St. Louis. So that's value. Max length, like if I wanted to do max length of 2 characters, and so like the attribute sounds like, I could only type in, if I type in ILLINO, I can't type it in. I can only type in the 2 states codes. And so max length prevents users from typing in anything more than 2 characters in length. Placeholder is a little bit different than value. Value is a value that's there by default. So if you have a default value, you include it in the value attribute. Placeholder, though, is something that's there to basically show users a format that you're looking for. And so you could see here that the value is actually a black text because that's the default. But placeholder, the suggestion is IL, but you can type in anything else. And if you delete the value, the placeholder comes back. So that's the gray text, that's kind of the suggested format. So placeholder is really good when you're expecting a certain format to kind of show the user what you're looking for. Especially, dates, credit card numbers, things of that nature that you type it in however they want. Do you want spaces? Do you want dashes? Do you want month, day, year, month, date? What do you want? Okay, so that's placeholder. And then autofocus, you can choose one control to have autofocus. Again, that is a Boolean attribute that says the city should have focus by default. So when I load the page there, you can see the cursor's on city. All right, so those are all your attributes of the input element. A few more new ones. There is also, let's see. Okay, good. This is always a fun one. If you guys are with me, pay attention to this. This is always a fun one to show. Input type of password. So you've seen these if you've ever typed in your password on, I'll put at the very bottom, I'll put a label. Okay, an input type of password, as you might guess, hides the user's password. Okay, and also tells password tools, like I use LastPass to manage my passwords. Tells password tools that, you know, that's something they want to pay attention to. What's kind of neat about this is that these password text box, because front-end code, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript by itself is not considered secure. Okay, and so one example of that is by using what we now know of input type of password. If I were to change this, right? So what's happened is my browser has this determined that this is a password text box. Well, if I inspect this code, and I can see that it did do some automatic encrypting for me. You can see all that encrypted jargon. Okay, but if I were to change this just using the developer tools in Chrome from an input type of password to an input type of text, you could see it just puts that right out in plain text. So if and when you ever forget your password, for example, if I go to sign in on my GoDaddy account, and if I forgot this guy's account and I wanted to see it, I'm just going to jargon this up so it's fake. It's the same process. Right click, inspect. It takes me to the input type of password. I just change it to input type of text. Change that one attribute. Oh, I changed the ID. I didn't change the type. There you go. Just change the type attribute to text and it'll put that in clear text for you so you can recover your password without having to go through a tedious email process and resetting it. A lot of my students have GitHub accounts that they forgot their password.
Mr. G?
Yeah.
Well, what about that button like on top of the password that says show password?
Not all sites have that. That's a good point. Where was that? Was that on GoDaddy?
Yeah.
Okay. Interestingly enough, not all sites have that. You're like, well, what do I even need to do that for? But not all sites have that. Let me go sign in. Oh, well, that's a little bit easier. But let's say maybe GoDaddy was a bad example for that. GitHub. And if I sign out of my GitHub, if I sign in, I got my forgot password, and you go through and reset it, but I don't have a show password here. And if I jargon this up, again, change the type this time to text, and there you go. So that's always a fun little trick. The next chunk of code worth showing here, there's also one called hidden, an input type of hidden. And you're like, why would I want to hide something? Well, a lot of times what you do is you give it an ID, give it a name. If you've ever heard of well, you've heard of cookies, right? Well, cookies are just information that's stored about you on a file on your hard drive. So you take chunks of information and they save it on your hard drive. Well, they can save information to your hard drive, or they can save information that you put in about yourself in a hidden field. And then what you do is you can take this hidden field and send it from page to page. So if you want to persist information across multiple pages, one option could be to keep that in a hidden field. HTTP is a stateless protocol, and what that means is every time the client and server interact, they forget about one another. And so what you wind up having to do is you have to persist the state or persist the information. You have to save the information. One way of saving information is to cookies. Another way of saving information is to a hidden field that could then be used to transfer that information, to different locations. Oh, I keep minimizing. Remind me. That's all a hidden field is. That's why it's useful, because a lot of times you're like, oh, we have a hidden field. When you launch the page, what does a hidden field look like? Well, it's literally, it's not there. Okay, so here's the input type of hidden on line 30. And if I launch the page, it's nothing there. Well, it's probably because we're going to use some JavaScript once we learn some JavaScript to do that, to put information into a hidden field. All right, couple text boxes. Another attribute that we didn't cover is the size attribute. All right, the difference between size and max length is a number of characters that you can type. Size is just how wide the text box is. So it's 5 characters wide, basically. So if you don't want the text box to be kind of the browser default width, you can change that using a size attribute. You can also use CSS to change the width attribute of a text box. So a couple different ways of doing that. Okay, we've been going for 55 minutes or so. Let's go ahead and take a pause and take a break. And so where we left off on slide 16. Now, just a quick glance forward. A lot of slides in this PowerPoint. So I'm going to start just kind of more referencing the code and pointing out the parts versus typing everything out. Otherwise, this lecture won't get finished today. So in order to speed it up a little bit, I'm going to type a little bit less. Now that I've hit the fundamentals, it really is just introducing new controls. But now that we've hit all the fundamentals, the new controls are easier. So we got checkboxes here. Checkbox controls. Obviously, the checkbox control, the idea is that you can check multiple. So it's like, I always think of magazine subscriptions. I don't know why. I always feel like, oh, what magazines do you want to subscribe to? Well, you could check 10 of them if you wanted. Versus a radio button, the idea is you can only have one option. Look, you can either have thin crust or deep dish or hand tossed. And by checking one radio button, it automatically unchecks another one. The way that you actually link these radio buttons together, though, is with the name. Typically, the name is almost like the ID in that it's unique, but that's not the case with these radio buttons. You could have multiple groups of radio buttons that are independent of each other, but the way that you group them together is by sharing the same name attribute. Okay, so you put these three, and therefore if you check hand-tossed radio button, it would uncheck the thin crust. Okay, you can only check one of these, whereas you can have multiple checks of these, and notice the names are separate, but even if you name the check boxes the same name, it doesn't make sense to do that. But if you did do that, you could still check multiple, and that's what they look like. If you've ever again used the web, I'm sure you've seen these controls, as you just never coded them before. Again, they're all done with the input tag. One unique control that's not an input tag would be a drop-down list, and a drop-down list is done with a select tag. And you could see here, this one, they have essentially categories of options, and so you could see this New Yorker option, style, pizza, as well as how big of a pizza do you want, or the Chicago, and that's done with this opt group. But typically inside of a select, if you don't want to have these option groups, you just have individual options. And so simply inside of a select tag, you could have just a bunch of options. If you want to have the groupings, then you have this additional tag called opt group. Okay, that's not as very common as just having a bunch of options. Inside of each option tag, then you've got a value attribute, but then what the user sees is the in between the opening and closing tag. This is the value that the user sees. The value that's used in here is typically something that you would use in the code, like in the JavaScript, for example. And you would say, well, if the user selected this option, the NY10, then do this. So JavaScript could set up like if-then statements or if-else statements to process the page differently. So again, the value is typically used in the JavaScript, whereas what the user sees is in between the opening and closing tag. Now, a list box is just like a drop-down list. It's coded the same way with the select tag, except for you put a size attribute. If you put a size attribute on a select tag, then it becomes more of a box with a scrolling bar, as opposed to a drop-down list. And so if you're trying to really conserve space, you want to use a drop-down list. If you got more space and you think it might be easier for the users to use a scroll bar as opposed to this drop-down list, you could do that. And especially see, like I think of like select your state. You always have select the state in a drop-down list. You just give them 50 options and they select from a drop-down list. A text area tag is also one that's a little bit different than this input and select tag. The text area is more of like you want the users to write maybe a couple paragraphs of response. And so a text area is like, please give me your comments, and they could type essentially as long as they want. Of course, you could limit that if you wanted to, but that's your text area. A lot of times done in like surveys and feedbacks and things of that nature. I already demonstrated labels and how labels are used. So earlier in the video, I kind of jumped ahead. And really, those labels are good for accessibility purposes. When you have users with motor skills, like maybe they have a shaky hand, right? And so they have a shaky hand, they have a hard time clicking a little box. But if they click near the box, they click on the label, it focuses that box. So by clicking on the label, it could select a radio button, for example. There are some controls to help with the visual layout of your controls, one of those being field set and legend. A field set and legend can kind of essentially draw a box around these controls and just show you that those controls are separate from the others. So the field set is the box. The legend is your title here. So the legend is, in this case, inside the legend tag you have crust, and then the field set just contains all of your controls in that area of the page. So that's field set and legend. Going a little bit faster now. We're not going to use this upload control in this class because typically you need the server-side control or the server-side code to make it work, because typically you got to upload a file to a server. So it's like, I think of, for example, Facebook, and you want to upload a new profile picture. That's done in a form with a input type of file. And then you could have this accept attribute that says, hey, I'm accepting JPEGs and GIFs. And then you add this attribute here, the encoding type, multi-part form data. But we're not going to do this a whole lot, but at least you have some exposure to it. When it comes to styling your forms, I take a glance at this, and you might think putting this inside of a table, and a lot of people do, just put it inside of a table and right align your text, and but that's not the recommended way. The recommended way would just be to use CSS, and you could see with CSS they're doing some floats, they're doing some margin for white space, text align, width, and so you can use just pure HTML and CSS to get good looking forms, even though again you might want to take to tables, like just visually that looks like that could be put in a table pretty easily, but it's much cleaner to just use HTML and CSS, so I encourage you to just stick with pure HTML and CSS. You could set up like the active control to have a border, and I see that on web pages more and more, where the control that has focus has some styling to it. And so here you can see any input control with focus receives a 2-pixel solid navy border. So that's the line of code right there. Again, hover and focus and all these pseudo selectors that have the colons, you can apply them to more than just anchor tags. And that's what we're doing here. We're applying the focus pseudo selector on any input control. Okay, access keys. Access keys are typically, if you have users using your web page a lot, then it helps to give them access keys so that they can input the information really quickly. A lot of times when you've got a new system that used to be like pen and paper, and then you transition it to a website, you have to transition all your old records from pen and paper into digital records. And so sometimes you have data entry specialists that might do that and put the old data on pen and paper into the new website, into the new system. Or if you just have data entry specialists, people that enter data all the time, from pen and paper into digital. I mean, there are jobs out there that are data entry. And so it really helps for them to have access keys. And access keys on Windows is the Alt key. And the way that I remember that is the Control P, like Control Print, those are your Windows hotkeys. But the Alt key then can jump us to that particular control. So let me go, and I can do this pretty quick. Like last name, if I set an access key equal to L. And if I launch this, right now the city has focus, but if I hit Alt L, you can see it highlighted the last name. So that's your access key. Those are hotkeys for the web page. And it's done with the Alt key on Windows, and on Mac, I don't know if any of my Mac users are out there know what the quick keys are for web pages. I don't know what it is off the top of my head because I'm not a Mac user. I'm sure someone will chime in at some point, maybe on YouTube. It can also help to identify access keys by an underlining of the character that's being used, and so that just shows the user if they use the letter L, Alt L in this case, it'll hop to that control. Okay. In addition to access keys, you have tab orders, and so again, a proper tab order helps users who can't use a mouse. What you don't want is control hopping all over the page. You want to make it in an order that makes sense to the end user. And I think of the way, either going down individual columns one at a time, left to right, or either that or going across the screen, almost how like you would read a book. Those are both, strategies that could be used. And doesn't really show tab order here, but I think it will show tab order in just a second. Built into HTML now, it used to not be built into HTML, we have some data validation controls, which is really nice. Marking an attribute as required means you cannot submit it, like first name, required. So that means I could not, if I change this to a submit button, let me comment out like the password thing here. I'm not using that. You see I get, please fill out this field, because I tried to submit my form without filling out the first name. So that's actually really nice. We used to have to use JavaScript to do that. Now that's built into HTML attributes by marking something as required. Autocomplete allows end user to use cookies on that field. So a lot of times in Chrome, they'll just have like all their user information, first name, last name, address, so on and so forth. And it will allow your web page to use cookies to auto-complete those fields. So that can be nice. And then no validate is the opposite of required. No validate says completely ignore this control as part of your validation. So notice the name is required, the address is ignored, zip is required, phone is required. No auto completing on the phone. So you got to make them type in their phone number instead of using their cookies to fill it in. And those are some. Now you'll notice different browsers handle it differently. So like this one, it showed red on their page. Maybe that's Firefox, or maybe this was a different version of Chrome. When I just did this, that's kind of the bad part, is you're up to the browser. Like notice it highlighted a little bit more black. It didn't highlight it red. So it's kind of browser dependent. Like if I look at this in Firefox, Firefox puts it red. So that's the downfall of using these built-in validation controls, is that you might not get the most uniform experience across different browsers. So if you want to control that a little bit better, you might still write your own validation logic in JavaScript. Or you can style these fields using required. So let's do that. Let's try and get that text box. Let's get that text box to have an input that's required. So in this case, it's doing it all the time. But notice this is the only field that's required. And so we could say, you could use that how you want. You could label that as required, and you could show users these are the required fields. And so if you got 30 fields and 10 of them are required, you could style them that way. Same thing if something is marked as invalid. So let's do that. So as soon as I fill it in, then it becomes valid and it's no longer red. But if I take it away, it's invalid and it goes red. So if I leave it blank and click register, yeah, it's not working. I take it out. Yeah, it's just how they work by default. I can't say that I love it, but it does provide some base functionality for validation of your data, which is really nice. You used to not have that. We learned how to do an attribute selector. So this is selecting all the input controls with an attribute of required. And you could style them that way as well, instead of using the required pseudo selector. Another way of doing the same thing. Regular expressions. Okay, we will study regular expressions when we get to JavaScript. But what regular expressions are custom validation requirements. And so you'll notice here for the zip code, 5 digits followed by a dash followed by 4 digits. And so this regular expression is a coding pattern that allows you to make custom validation requirements on your data. And so you can use regular expressions in your HTML by setting them in this pattern attribute. Okay. I would say everything that we've covered up until this point is majority of what you'll use when it comes to forms. The next 10 or 15 slides I'm going to go through kind of quick because these controls are newer and not used quite as much. Okay. For example, we've got this control called data list, and what data list is a drop-down list. It kind of looks different in different browsers, like notice IE versus Chrome, of suggested selections. So the user can either they can type in a data list, or they can select from a drop-down. Okay, so those are the two options that a data list gives you, like the pre-loaded options to select from, but it's also a text box that the user could type in. And you might think, oh, well, Google uses that. Well, what Google uses is quite a bit different, because Google looks for not only what you've searched in the past, but also what other people are currently searching. So if you start typing a hot topic in Google that a lot of people are searching for, Google's going to recommend it for you. Okay, so there's actually quite a bit of other things going on there, not just using this data list control, which is static options that don't change, right? Google gives you more dynamic experience there. Input type of email. So this is nice in that it knows to expect something that looks like an email. So if I mark this as an email control and I mark it as required, the web browser is smart enough to know that you should have something at something dot something. So it should be formatted like an email address. That doesn't make it, a valid email address. You could still provide me with a fake email, or provide the web page with a fake email and kind of, fake it out. But it at least is formatted like an email. Now, of course, to get it, you need to verify their email address. You got to send them an email, and they need to click on a link, and that's all part of how you verify their email address. And even then, they can just give you a junk email address. There's nothing stopping them from doing that. Same thing with URL, something that looks like a URL. Same thing with telephone, something that's formatted like a telephone number. So again, your browser is smart enough to know that what's typed in here is not an email address. And they give you a little the required message on this text box is different than just a normal text box, because it's saying, hey, it doesn't look like an email address. You do have these numeric up and down controls and these slider controls. They're somewhat useful. Input type of number, input type of range. I don't know. Don't see those a ton, I suppose. You do have a nice calendar control. I would say this is fairly useful. If we look at the calendar control, it's actually pretty easy to code in HTML. I will tell you, I've had to code a calendar control before. Here's input type of date. And that gives you a full featured calendar, month, date, year, current date and time. I mean, this is really nice. I do like this, input type of date. And you've got all these other ones. You can do time, week, month. I mean, you can really break down the different parts of a date, individual day, a month, a week. And that's all built in. Now this search, let's see if they give us input type of search. What the way that this works, and it's kind of a fake search, is it sends you to Google. Or in this case, if you do an input type of search, you could see there, the action points you at google.com/search. And so that's not really a search feature that you would probably implement, I guess, if you want to implement a Google search inside your site. But most of the time when you're searching, you want to search your own site. So again, to do that, you need server side, which you do learn in second and third semester. You got this color palette with an input type of color. Inside ranking, you used to be able to customize it with your own colors. If you don't want it to be red, you could choose your own background color. I remember back in the day, MySpace used to do that, for those of you who are old enough to be on MySpace. And there's an output element. This output element, Nothing special. There's a progress and meter element that shows a progress bar and a meter bar. Basically, same concept. They just look a little different. Like you're raising money towards a goal. And jQuery has its own set of features for these controls. And so a lot of times you don't wind up using this built-in progress because there's some other controls out there that are slightly better. And here you even see a lot of times you need a little bit of JavaScript to get these to dynamically load. Okay, so again, kind of covered the important controls slowly, and then I went through the lesser used controls a little bit faster so that this lecture didn't last, for 3 hours. What I've got for you guys tonight is a homework assignment. I'm going to open that up. I'll stop the recording here.